My beloved child, something shifted yesterday so quietly that almost no one around your soulmate understood what they were witnessing, but the third party noticed immediately, because the thing they believed they could still influence suddenly slipped out of their hands. It was not a dramatic confrontation. There was no scene, no harsh exchange, no moment designed for attention. In fact, that is exactly why what happened matters. Your soulmate simply stopped moving in the direction someone else expected him to move. And when he did, one private decision exposed a truth that words had been hiding for far too long. Don't skip, because the surprising part is not what the third party lost yesterday. The surprising part is what your soulmate quietly protected instead. For a while, there had been an assumption around him that time would eventually make his feelings simpler. People thought distance would settle things. They believed silence would become acceptance, that unanswered questions would eventually stop returning to him, and that if enough ordinary days passed, he would naturally choose whatever path seemed easiest. Even your soulmate tried to believe that for a moment. He kept himself busy. He listened to advice. He acted calm when people mentioned the future. Yet something kept interrupting that calm. It happened in the smallest moments, a familiar thought appearing when he least expected it, a memory surfacing while he was doing something completely unrelated, a strange hesitation whenever someone described a future that looked perfectly reasonable but somehow did not feel like his. And yesterday, that hesitation finally became a decision. Here is where the story becomes different from what the third party expected. They had been confident about something. Perhaps too confident. They believed they understood where your soulmate stood because they were watching his actions from the outside. They saw his silence and interpreted it as distance from you. They saw his patience and assumed he was moving on. They saw him avoiding difficult conversations and believed that meant he had already chosen another direction. But silence does not always mean absence of feeling. Sometimes silence is where a person finally hears what they have been avoiding. And yesterday, your soulmate heard it clearly. There was a plan being discussed around him, something connected to his next chapter, something that would have quietly placed more distance between the life he was building and the possibility of you being part of it. Nothing dangerous. Nothing dramatic. Just one of those ordinary decisions that look small until you realize what it represents. The third party believed he would agree. They had reasons to believe it. He had not openly resisted before. He had allowed conversations to continue. He had listened without revealing much. So when the moment arrived, they expected a simple yes. Instead, your soulmate paused. Not for a second. Long enough for someone else in the room to notice. And then he said something far calmer than anyone expected, "That isn't what I want." Those 5 words changed the atmosphere. He did not explain immediately. He did not argue. He simply refused to continue toward a future that no longer felt honest to him. The third party tried to understand what had changed, because from their perspective nothing obvious had happened. No new conversation with you had been announced. No public declaration had been made. There was no visible reason for him to suddenly become certain. But that was the part they could not see. This decision had not begun yesterday. Yesterday was only the first time it became visible. For weeks, maybe longer, your soulmate had been noticing something about himself. Every time he imagined completely letting go of you, the feeling did not resemble peace. It resembled unfinished business. Every time he tried to convince himself that another direction would be easier, he found himself comparing that future to something he had felt with you. And the comparison was becoming impossible to ignore. Stay till the end, because there was one detail in yesterday's decision that made the third party realize this was not temporary emotion. Your soulmate did not merely reject their plan. He quietly changed something afterward. Alone. Without telling anyone. He went back to something he had previously prepared for his future and removed one choice from it. That choice had represented moving forward without considering you anymore. For a long time, it sat there like a backup plan, a way of telling himself, if nothing changes, I will simply accept this. Yesterday, he deleted that escape route. Not because he suddenly expects everything between you to become perfect. Not because he believes feelings alone solve every difficulty. But because he realized something much more mature. He did not want to make a permanent decision merely to avoid an uncomfortable truth. And the uncomfortable truth was you still mattered. Much more than he had admitted. That was the third party's real loss yesterday. It was not a possession. It was not status. It was not some dramatic victory or defeat. They lost the certainty that your soulmate could eventually be guided away from what his own heart had been telling him. And that realization unsettled them because suddenly all the small signs they had dismissed began making sense. Why did he become unusually quiet whenever your name came close to the conversation? Why did he remember tiny things about you that no one expected him to remember? Why did his expression change whenever someone spoke as though your chapter was completely finished? Why did he keep refusing opportunities that should have looked appealing on paper? The answer had been sitting underneath everything. He was not trying to erase you. He was trying to understand why he could not. Something important is waiting for you here, because this does not mean you should chase him, predict his next move, or build your peace around what another person may decide. The deeper meaning is almost the opposite. Your soulmate's decision became clearer when he stopped reacting to everyone else and finally asked himself one quiet question: if nobody were telling me what I should want, what would I choose? And your presence appeared inside his answer. Think about that for a moment. Not because someone convinced him. Not because he was pressured. Not because the third party suddenly became less interesting or less important as a person. But because when everything external became quiet, he recognized which connection still felt emotionally unfinished. That realization changed him yesterday. The third party noticed the change almost immediately. They asked whether he was reconsidering everything. Your soulmate avoided giving a full answer. Then came the moment that left them without their old certainty. They asked him whether someone had influenced his decision. He looked down for a few seconds and answered, "No. That's why I know it's mine." There was no accusation hidden in those words. No hostility. Just clarity. And clarity can change a room faster than anger ever could. After that, the third party understood that persuading him would only make him more certain that he needed to think for himself. So the conversation softened. Questions replaced assumptions. Your soulmate remained calm. Yet inside him, something powerful had already settled. He was no longer deciding whether his feelings for you were convenient. He was deciding whether he was finally ready to be truthful about them. And there is another detail you need to hear. Earlier that same day, before making the decision, your soulmate had come across something connected to you. It was ordinary enough that anyone else would have overlooked it. A phrase. A memory. Perhaps something he had saved and forgotten. But it brought him back to a moment between you when he felt completely understood without having to perform, explain, or prove anything. That memory became the contrast he could not escape. He realized how many recent choices had been driven by what looked sensible rather than what felt sincere. That does not mean he abandoned reason. It means he finally allowed reason and emotion to sit at the same table. And when they did, both pointed toward the same unresolved truth. He needed to stop pretending your place in his heart had disappeared simply because the situation had become complicated. The third party sensed that shift, and yes, there was panic, but not the kind created by danger. It was the panic of suddenly realizing that an outcome you had treated as guaranteed was never truly yours to control. They had mistaken your soulmate's hesitation for agreement. Yesterday proved otherwise. Yet this is where the story becomes even more surprising. Your soulmate's secret decision was not to run toward you immediately. It was something quieter and, in many ways, more meaningful. He decided that the next time he approached you, he would not come carrying confusion. He would not test your feelings. He would not appear briefly and disappear again. He wanted to understand what he could genuinely offer before asking anything from you. That decision explains why things may still look quiet from the outside. Quiet does not always mean nothing is happening. Sometimes it means someone is finally doing the internal work they once avoided. He began thinking about what honesty would require from him. What would he have to admit? What would he need to apologize for? Which misunderstandings could no longer be left unresolved? And most importantly, could he approach you without expecting you to immediately make everything easy for him? That question changed the tone of his thoughts. Because for the first time, he was not only asking whether he wanted you. He was asking whether he was prepared to show you, consistently and respectfully, what wanting you actually means. That is the decision that proved where his heart was leaning. Not a dramatic promise. Not a perfect ending. A willingness to stop taking the connection lightly. And somewhere behind the scenes, the third party now understands that yesterday was not simply a bad day for their expectations. It was the day your soulmate stopped letting other people write the final sentence of a story he had never emotionally finished. But there is still one piece he has told no one, not even the person who questioned him yesterday. Because after everything became quiet, after the conversation ended and he was finally alone, your soulmate opened something connected to you and almost reached out. Almost. His hand stopped for a reason that has nothing to do with losing interest. And what he decided to do instead may reveal even more about what is coming next. The strangest part is that he had already written the first few words when he suddenly stopped, because in that quiet second your soulmate realized that reaching out simply because emotion was strong would only repeat an old pattern. He looked at the unfinished message for longer than he expected, reading the words again and again, and something inside him whispered that if he was going to enter your life again, he needed to arrive with more than longing. He needed clarity. That is why he erased the message instead of sending it. From the outside, that could look like hesitation. But inside him, it felt completely different. It was the first time he chose patience, not because he was uncertain about you, but because he was becoming certain about how he wanted to treat the connection. Don't skip, because what happened after he put the phone down explains why yesterday's decision affected the third party so deeply. Your soulmate walked away from that screen and began thinking about the exact moments when things between you became complicated. Not just what you did. Not just what circumstances did. He finally started looking at himself. He remembered moments when he could have spoken more clearly but stayed silent. Times when he expected you to understand something he never actually explained. Moments when pride, timing, confusion, or outside opinions made him step backward when part of him wanted to step closer. And the realization was uncomfortable, but strangely freeing. Some of the distance he had blamed on circumstances had also been created by his own hesitation. That understanding changed the question completely. He was no longer asking, "Will this connection somehow return to me?" He started asking, "If I want something different, what do I need to do differently?" There is a quiet kind of maturity in that question, and the third party sensed it without knowing exactly what had happened inside him. Later, when they spoke again, they tried approaching the situation carefully. They did not push the old plan as strongly this time. Instead, they asked your soulmate whether yesterday had simply been emotional, whether perhaps he should give himself a few days before changing anything else. He listened. He did not become defensive. And then he gave an answer that made them realize his decision had deeper roots than they hoped. He said, "I've been giving myself time. That's what brought me here. Stay till the end," because those words were only the beginning. The third party suddenly understood something they had overlooked for months. While everyone thought your soulmate was undecided, he had actually been gathering evidence from his own feelings. Every ordinary day without you had been teaching him something. Every distraction that failed to replace the connection taught him something. Every time someone suggested that he should simply choose whatever was easiest, he noticed a quiet resistance rising inside him. He had not been standing still. He had been discovering what remained when excitement, pressure, and outside voices faded away. And what remained was remarkably simple. He missed the feeling of being understood by you. Not idealized. Not endlessly reassured. Understood. There had been something about the way you once saw beneath his surface that stayed with him longer than he expected. He remembered how certain conversations with you felt different from ordinary conversation. You noticed details. You sometimes understood his silence before he explained it. Even when things were imperfect, there had been moments when he felt less like the version of himself everyone expected and more like the person he actually was. That was what the third party had never fully understood. They believed they were competing with memories, but your soulmate was not clinging to the past because it was familiar. He was comparing how different futures made him feel. And one future kept asking him to become less honest with himself. The other asked him to become more honest. Something important is waiting for you in that difference. Because your soulmate did not suddenly decide that everything involving you had been perfect. In fact, his reflection made him remember the difficult moments too. The unanswered questions. The mismatched timing. The times when both of you may have protected yourselves instead of saying what was actually happening underneath. But instead of using those memories as proof that the connection should disappear, he saw them differently yesterday. He saw two people who may have felt something meaningful before they fully knew how to handle it. That realization did not guarantee an outcome. It simply made him stop pretending that difficulty automatically meant absence of feeling. Then came another unexpected moment. He opened a drawer, a folder, or perhaps a quiet place where he keeps things he rarely looks at, and there was something there connected to you. Nothing dramatic. Something small enough that anyone else might have thrown it away without thinking twice. But he had kept it. For months. Maybe without admitting why. When he held it again yesterday, one question rose inside him: why did I keep this if I truly believed I was finished? He did not have an immediate answer. And somehow, that silence answered him more clearly than words could. The third party knew nothing about that object. They knew nothing about the unfinished message. They knew nothing about the conversation your soulmate was having privately with himself. All they could see was the result, a person who suddenly seemed less persuadable. That is where their panic came from. Not because they had lost everything in some dramatic sense, but because they realized the influence they thought they had was becoming smaller. Your soulmate was beginning to trust his own judgment again. And once someone starts making choices from genuine clarity, it becomes difficult for anyone else to steer them simply through expectation. There was another conversation later that evening, and this one was even quieter. Someone close to your soulmate asked him whether there was still a person he had not been completely honest with. He did not answer at first. He looked away. Then came a faint smile, not happiness exactly, more like the expression of someone who has just been caught recognizing a truth. Maybe, he said. The person beside him did not ask who. They did not need to. Instead, they asked something far more important: are you going to do anything about it? That question followed him for the rest of the night. And this is where his secret decision became more specific. He decided that before contacting you, he would settle one remaining matter that had been creating confusion around him. It was something he had allowed to remain open because closing it required a difficult but respectful conversation. Perhaps an expectation someone had placed on him. Perhaps a future arrangement he had never fully wanted. Perhaps simply an emotional ambiguity that needed to end before he could approach you honestly. He realized that contacting you while leaving that uncertainty behind him would be unfair. So he chose to handle it first. This is why the third party may be feeling the shift so strongly now. They are beginning to understand that yesterday's no was not isolated. It was the beginning of your soulmate putting his life back into alignment with what he actually believes. And there is something deeply revealing about what happened next. When the third party asked whether his decision had anything to do with you, your soulmate could have denied it. That would have been easy. He could have avoided an uncomfortable conversation by saying you were irrelevant. But he did not. He remained silent for a moment and then said something surprisingly balanced: it has to do with me finally being honest about what matters. Notice what he did not say. He did not turn you into an excuse. He did not blame anyone. He did not make promises he could not yet keep. He simply acknowledged that his own truth had become impossible to keep pushing aside. For the first time, the third party saw that the situation was not about winning your soulmate's attention. It was about whether he could continue living according to choices that felt disconnected from himself. And once they understood that, the conversation changed completely. They became quieter. Your soulmate became calmer. The tension that had surrounded everything began losing its power because no one was fighting anymore. There was simply a truth sitting between them that could no longer be ignored. Yet what matters most may be what your soulmate did after everyone else went away. He returned to the message he had deleted earlier. But this time he did not start typing. He opened your contact, looked at your name, and simply sat there. Something inside him wanted immediate connection. Another part of him knew one final conversation had to happen first. And instead of choosing the quick relief of sending a message, he chose the harder path of preparing himself to speak honestly when the time was right. That decision says more than a dramatic message ever could. He was not trying to get a reaction from you. He was trying to become someone capable of having the conversation properly. Maybe you have felt unseen lately. Maybe you have wondered whether your presence ever truly mattered, especially during the silence. But sometimes the deepest impact we leave on someone does not reveal itself while we are standing beside them. It becomes visible later, when life offers them easier options and they discover that ease is not the same thing as meaning. That seems to be what your soulmate confronted yesterday. He could choose what looked uncomplicated, or he could finally acknowledge the connection that continued asking him to grow. He chose growth. Quietly. Without an audience. And now there is only one unfinished piece between his decision and whatever happens next. The conversation he decided to have first. The one that could finally remove the ambiguity that has kept him standing between two versions of his future. He already knows what he wants to say. He has replayed the opening line in his mind more than once. But when that conversation happens, there is one unexpected detail. The third party may reveal to him something they have known about you for longer than your soulmate realizes. And depending on how he hears it, that detail could change the way he understands the entire distance between you. What the third party finally admitted was not meant to change your soulmate's mind, yet the moment those words entered the room, he understood that part of the distance between you had never been as simple as he had been told. For a long time, he believed you had pulled away because your feelings had faded, because perhaps you had already accepted a different future, or because what existed between you simply had not meant enough to survive uncertainty. That explanation hurt, but it was clean. Easy to repeat. Easy to live with. And because no one corrected it, he slowly built decisions around it. But now the third party was sitting across from him with a very different truth on their face, and your soulmate could sense that something had been held back. He did not rush them. He did not demand an answer. He simply asked one calm question: what do you know that I don't? There was a pause. Longer than expected. Then came the admission. At some point in the past, the third party had realized that you were not indifferent at all. They had noticed a detail, heard something indirectly, or understood from the way you reacted that your silence had never meant absence of care. You had been protecting yourself. You had been waiting for clarity that never arrived. And the part that stopped your soulmate completely was this: there may have been a moment when you were more open to hearing from him than he ever realized. Don't skip, because this is where yesterday's secret decision became something much bigger than simply choosing who he wanted. Your soulmate suddenly had to confront the possibility that he had spent months interpreting your silence through information that was incomplete. He leaned back, thinking through old moments with a completely different perspective. Messages that seemed cold began feeling guarded instead. Distances he once viewed as rejection started looking more like self-protection. Even moments when you seemed to move forward could now be understood as you trying to preserve your dignity while waiting for him to decide whether he was truly present. And for the first time, your soulmate recognized something important. While he had been waiting for a sign from you, you may have been waiting for the same thing from him. Two people standing on opposite sides of the same silence, each believing the other had already chosen to leave. That realization did not make him angry. It made him quiet. Deeply quiet. Because sometimes the most powerful truths do not arrive like a dramatic revelation. They arrive like a missing piece finally sliding into place. Suddenly, too many memories made sense at once. Why your energy changed when he became inconsistent. Why you stopped reaching as much after certain moments. Why you seemed to care but also kept a careful distance. Your soulmate had once taken those changes personally, but now he saw the possibility that you were simply responding to what he had shown you. Stay till the end, because what he said next surprised even the third party. He did not ask, "Why didn't you tell me?" He did not blame them. Instead, he looked down and said, "Then I should have asked her myself." That sentence carried more growth than anyone in the room expected. He understood that even if others had influenced the situation, the responsibility for understanding your heart could never belong entirely to someone else. He had allowed assumptions to replace conversation. He had accepted convenient explanations because facing uncertainty directly required courage he did not yet possess. Yesterday, that changed. Something important is waiting for you here. Your soulmate's decision was no longer simply, "I still want this person." It became, "I need to stop letting second-hand information decide what I believe about them." That distinction matters. Because wanting someone can remain emotional and passive. Choosing to seek truth requires action, maturity, and respect. And that is exactly where his mind went next. He started wondering what you would say if he finally asked you directly what had really happened between you. Not what other people thought happened. Not what silence suggested. Not what pride had whispered. What actually happened? What did you feel when he withdrew? What did you need that he never understood? At what point did you stop waiting for him to become clear? And had you truly moved on emotionally, or had you simply learned how to continue living without an answer? These questions stirred something inside him that felt different from longing. It felt like responsibility. He did not want to return to your life merely because he missed you. He wanted to understand whether he had earned the right to reopen something you may have worked hard to make peace with. That thought softened him. For the first time, his focus shifted away from what he might gain and toward what you might need. Meanwhile, the third party was beginning to experience their own realization. They had expected your soulmate to hear this information and immediately rush toward you. If he had done that, perhaps they could have dismissed the moment as emotional impulse. But he did not. He became more careful. More deliberate. The truth had not made him reckless. It had made him thoughtful. And that was what unsettled them most, because this was no temporary reaction. He was beginning to understand the depth of what he had mishandled. Later, when he was alone again, he returned to the message he almost sent the night before. This time, the opening words came differently. He did not type anything dramatic. He did not write a confession designed to overwhelm you. He began with something simple: "There are things I think I misunderstood." He stared at that sentence for a long moment. Then he added another, "And I don't want to keep guessing about you." He stopped again. You might think the next step was obvious, but it was not. Your soulmate still did not press send. Because somewhere inside him, another question had appeared: if he contacted you now, would it be because he was finally prepared to listen, or because he desperately wanted reassurance that you still cared? That question mattered enough to make him wait. He realized that if he approached you seeking proof that you had never stopped feeling something, then he would still be making the conversation about himself. So he decided on a different intention. If he reached out, he would not ask you to rescue him from uncertainty. He would tell the truth about his own part first. He would acknowledge what he had misunderstood. He would admit where he had been unclear. And only then would he give you space to tell him what your experience had been, even if your answer was not what he hoped to hear. That was the strongest decision he made yesterday. Not choosing you as if you were something to win. Choosing honesty, even when honesty offered no guaranteed outcome. The third party did not know about this second decision yet. They only knew that their old influence had weakened. But your soulmate had quietly crossed an internal line. He no longer wanted a version of you created by assumptions, stories, or memories. He wanted the truth of who you are now. And maybe that is the part that feels personally meaningful for you too. Being chosen is not always about someone making a dramatic statement. Sometimes it is about someone finally becoming willing to see you accurately. To stop projecting old fears onto your silence. To stop expecting you to prove what they never had the courage to ask. To recognize that you may have had your own reasons, boundaries, and disappointments all along. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that now. And strangely, that understanding is making his feelings calmer rather than louder. He is not chasing a fantasy anymore. He is preparing for a real conversation between two real people who may have misunderstood each other deeply. Yet one final thing happened before the night ended. Your soulmate went back through an old exchange between you, not searching for romantic words, but looking for the exact moment where the tone changed. He found it. A message he had read dozens of times suddenly felt completely different because of what he now knew. There was one sentence from you that he had originally interpreted as distance. But reading it again yesterday, he noticed something he had missed. The wording was not closing a door. It was asking whether he would step through it with honesty. He had not understood that at the time. Now he did. And as he sat there, staring at those words, your soulmate finally made the decision that could change everything that follows. He would contact you, but only after doing one last thing first. He wanted to remove the final source of confusion from his life so that when he spoke to you, there would be no hidden ambiguity behind his words. No mixed direction. No unfinished obligation. Just the truth. And what he discovered while trying to close that final chapter may be the one detail neither you nor the third party ever expected him to find. The final chapter he thought he was closing turned out to contain one detail that changed the meaning of almost everything. Because when your soulmate went back to settle that last source of confusion, he expected a simple conversation, a clean ending, and perhaps a little discomfort, but instead he discovered that the third party had been aware of something important long before he was. It came out almost accidentally. There was no dramatic confession. No confrontation. Just one sentence spoken too casually, and your soulmate immediately noticed that it did not fit with what he had previously been told. He asked them to repeat it. They hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Suddenly, the room felt different. Your soulmate leaned forward and asked, very calmly, "How long have you known that?" The third party tried to explain that they had never intended to interfere, that they were only trying to protect everyone from more confusion, that perhaps they believed silence was better than reopening an uncertain connection. But your soulmate was no longer interested in assumptions. Yesterday had already taught him the cost of living according to other people's interpretations. So he asked for the entire story. Don't skip, because what he heard next did not make him angry. It made him finally understand why so many moments between you had felt strangely incomplete. At some point, there had been an opportunity for clarity between you, perhaps a message that almost reached him, perhaps a conversation where your feelings were mentioned indirectly, perhaps simply information that would have made him realize you were not as emotionally distant as he believed. The third party knew enough to understand that your feelings were more complicated than your silence suggested, but they never fully passed that understanding along. Maybe they thought they were preventing disappointment. Maybe they believed your soulmate needed to move forward. Maybe they were protecting their own hope that if enough time passed, he would stop looking backward. Whatever the reason, your soulmate realized one thing immediately: he had spent too long building conclusions from an incomplete picture. And this time, instead of blaming anyone, he turned the realization inward. I should have spoken to her directly, he said again, but now the words carried even greater weight. That sentence became the dividing line between the person he had been and the person he was trying to become. He could no longer hide behind timing, mixed signals, or what other people claimed to know. If he wanted truth, he had to participate in creating it. Something important is waiting for you here, because this is where his secret decision became more than an emotional choice. Your soulmate decided he would no longer allow the third party or anyone else to become the interpreter of your connection. Not because he assumed you still wanted him. Not because he believed the ending had already been written in his favor. But because he finally understood that whatever truth existed between you deserved to come from the two people who had actually lived it. That realization brought him an unexpected kind of peace. For months, he had been carrying questions as though they were permanent. Suddenly, he saw that some questions were only unanswered because nobody had been brave enough to ask them. Stay till the end, because what happened after that made the third party realize their position had changed completely. Your soulmate thanked them. That was not the reaction they expected. He did not punish them with silence. He did not turn the conversation into a battle. He simply said he understood that people sometimes make choices based on what they believe is best, but from now on, he wanted to make his own decisions with complete information. The third party heard the boundary inside those calm words. They understood that the influence they once had over his interpretation of you was gone. And strangely, the entire atmosphere softened. There was nothing left to fight about. Your soulmate was not choosing conflict. He was choosing responsibility. Later, when he was alone, he returned once more to the unfinished message. Only this time, he did not begin by explaining everything he had learned. He did not want to arrive in your world carrying gossip, blame, or a complicated story about what other people had done. He wanted the first thing you heard from him to be about his own truth. So he erased the previous opening and wrote something simpler. I've realized I made assumptions when I should have asked you. He paused. Then another line appeared. I don't know what you feel now, and I won't pretend that I do. But if you're open to it, I would like to have one honest conversation. He read those words several times. They felt different from everything he had almost sent before. There was no demand inside them. No attempt to force an outcome. No promise too large for reality. Just an invitation. That mattered to him because he finally understood that caring about you also meant respecting the possibility that you had changed while he was figuring himself out. Maybe your heart still carried something. Maybe it did not. Maybe you had questions of your own. Maybe you needed time. For the first time, your soulmate was prepared to let your answer belong entirely to you. And that, more than anything else, proved who he really wanted to become around you. He was not searching for control. He was searching for truth. Yet he still did not send the message immediately. There was one final thing he needed to settle inside himself. He asked a question that may surprise you. If she tells me she needs space, can I respect that without turning it into rejection? He sat with that question because he knew the old version of himself might have interpreted uncertainty as a reason to retreat forever. Now he wanted to be different. He wanted enough emotional steadiness to hear you clearly instead of hearing only what his fears expected. That is why yesterday's loss sent the third party into such uncertainty. They were watching someone they thought they understood become unexpectedly grounded. Your soulmate was not being pulled toward you through drama. He was moving toward honesty through reflection. And that is much harder to interrupt. Somewhere during those quiet hours, another memory surfaced. You had once said something to him that seemed ordinary at the time, perhaps something about not wanting perfect words, only truthful ones. He had almost forgotten it. But yesterday it returned with remarkable clarity. And suddenly he understood what you may have been asking from him all along. Not grand gestures. Not impossible certainty. Presence. Clarity. Consistency. Things that sound simple until someone realizes how much courage they require. He looked back at the connection and recognized all the moments when he had feelings but not consistency, hope but not clarity, affection but not enough courage to name what was happening. That realization did not diminish what he felt. It made him understand what those feelings would need to become if he ever wanted a different future with you. Something inside him settled. The question was no longer simply, do I want her? The answer to that had become increasingly obvious. The harder question was, can I show up differently than I did before? And for the first time, he believed he could try. Not perfectly. Not overnight. But intentionally. The third party sensed this change again the following time they spoke. They asked whether he had decided what he was going to do. Your soulmate smiled slightly and gave an answer that caught them off guard. I'm going to stop deciding her answer for her. Think about that. For months, he had quietly assumed you would reject him, misunderstand him, or no longer care. Those assumptions allowed him to remain safe because they meant he never had to risk hearing the actual truth. Yesterday, he recognized that pretending to know your answer was just another form of avoidance. If you said no, he would respect it. If you needed time, he would respect that too. But he would no longer hide behind an imaginary response you had never actually given. That was the moment the third party finally understood what had been lost. Not your soulmate as a person. Not some contest. They had lost the old version of him, the version who could be kept still by uncertainty. And there was nothing threatening about what replaced it. Just someone finally willing to have a conversation he had postponed for far too long. Maybe that is why this part of the story feels different. There is no dramatic victory here. There is something more meaningful: accountability. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that a genuine connection does not become stronger because two people feel intensely. It becomes stronger when they can speak clearly, listen carefully, and make choices without using silence as protection. That is what he wants to find out with you now. Could the two of you speak without pretending the past never happened? Could you acknowledge what hurt without turning every mistake into a permanent identity? Could you discover who each other has become rather than trying to return to exactly who you were? Those questions are still unanswered. And strangely, your soulmate is no longer afraid of that. He has started seeing unanswered questions as an invitation to honesty rather than a sign that everything is doomed. As the evening grew quieter, he opened your contact one final time. The message remained there. Simple. Respectful. Real. His finger hovered over the screen, and something shifted inside him. He was not hoping for a perfect response anymore. He was hoping for a truthful one. And that difference gave him the courage he had been missing. But just seconds before he was ready to send it, another notification appeared. It came from someone your soulmate had not expected to hear from at all. Someone who knew both sides of the story more closely than he realized. The message contained only a few words at first, but one line immediately caught his attention: "There's something about her you should understand before you reach out." Your soulmate froze not from fear, but from recognition. Because the person sending that message was someone he had once trusted completely, someone who had remained silent throughout most of the distance between you. And now, after all this time, they were finally ready to explain why you may have stepped back when you did. What they told him next would not erase the past, but it could completely change the way he understands your silence, your boundaries, and the one moment he has regretted more than he ever admitted. The message did not reveal some dramatic secret about you. It revealed something far more personal. Your soulmate had misunderstood the exact moment when you began protecting your heart. The person who contacted him had watched the situation from closer than he realized, and they remembered a conversation from long ago when you were not asking for perfection, promises, or certainty. You were asking for one simple sign that the connection mattered enough for your soulmate to speak honestly. That sign never came in the way you needed it. So eventually, you stopped waiting where anyone could see. Your soulmate read those words twice, then a third time, because suddenly one memory returned with almost uncomfortable clarity. There had been a moment when you became quieter with him. He had noticed it immediately, but instead of asking why, he had convinced himself that your feelings were disappearing. Now he was learning that the opposite may have been true. You had not stepped back because nothing remained. You had stepped back because continuing to care without knowing where you stood had become emotionally exhausting. Don't skip, because this was the moment your soulmate stopped viewing your distance as something done to him and began understanding what may have created it. The person messaging him explained that you had once said something remarkably simple: you could handle an honest answer, even if it was not the answer you hoped for, but uncertainty was harder because it kept you suspended between moving forward and holding on. Your soulmate stared at that line. It felt familiar not because he remembered hearing those exact words, but because he remembered your behavior around that time. You had given him openings. Small ones. Nothing dramatic. A question that could have led somewhere deeper. A pause where you seemed to be waiting for him to say more. A message that contained just enough vulnerability for him to meet you halfway. And each time, he had hesitated. He thought he was being careful. You may have experienced that same caution as absence. That distinction landed heavily. Something important is waiting for you here, because your soulmate did not use this new information to create a fantasy where everything would automatically become easy. Instead, he recognized something more grounded. Two people can care about each other and still misunderstand each other badly enough to create distance. Feelings alone do not translate themselves. Someone has to speak. Someone has to listen. Someone has to risk being clear. And yesterday, for perhaps the first time, your soulmate understood that he had spent too much time hoping you would somehow know what he never properly expressed. The message continued. The person explained that after you pulled back, you never spoke about your soulmate with bitterness. That surprised him. He had imagined that perhaps you resented him, perhaps that resentment was why the connection felt closed. But apparently, whenever his name came up, your reaction had been quieter than that. You seemed disappointed, yes. Protective, certainly. But not cruel. There was still tenderness underneath the distance, even if you refused to build your life around uncertainty anymore. Your soulmate lowered his phone. For several minutes, he did nothing. He simply sat with the realization that while he had been telling himself you had stopped caring, you may actually have been learning how to care without abandoning your own peace. That reframed everything. Stay till the end, because his next decision was different from every decision he had made earlier. He opened the message he had prepared for you and deleted half of it, not because the words were wrong, but because he suddenly understood that explaining himself too much could become another way of avoiding the real conversation. He did not need to send you a perfect speech. He needed to create enough safety for honesty to happen between you. So he shortened the message. I think I misunderstood some things between us. I also know I was not always clear when I should have been. If you are comfortable with it, I would like to talk, not to pressure anything, just to understand each other honestly. He read it slowly. There was something almost unfamiliar about seeing himself communicate without hiding behind vagueness. No coded message. No emotional test. No attempt to make you guess what he meant. Just truth. And then another realization stopped him. If he sent this, he needed to be prepared not only for what he hoped to hear, but for everything you might honestly say. You might tell him that his silence hurt more than he knew. You might say there were times you felt unimportant. You might admit that part of you still cared while another part had learned to live differently. Or perhaps you would simply say that you needed time. He imagined each possibility, and instead of searching for the response that would comfort him most, he asked himself whether he could listen without interrupting your experience. That question was the final test of yesterday's change. Wanting you was easy compared with hearing you. Missing you was easy compared with accepting the impact of his own indecision. And yet, strangely, he felt ready. Not because he suddenly had every answer, but because he no longer needed to control the conversation. Meanwhile, the third party knew almost none of this. They only saw your soulmate becoming more settled after receiving that unexpected message. At first they assumed the new information might discourage him. Instead, it gave him a kind of calm they had never seen in him around this situation. They asked whether something had happened. He answered, "I finally understand why she stopped waiting." Those words immediately changed their expression. Perhaps they expected blame. Instead, your soulmate added, "And I understand why she had to." That was the moment their panic softened into something else, realization. They understood that your soulmate was no longer romanticizing the past. He was seeing you as a whole person with boundaries, choices, and reasons of your own. And that made his decision stronger, not weaker. Because he was not moving toward an idealized memory anymore. He was deciding whether he could meet the real you where you are now. The third party asked one final question, "And if she doesn't want to go back?" Your soulmate remained silent for a moment, then said something that surprised everyone involved. "Then I won't ask her to go back. I'm asking whether there's anything real to build from where we are now." That sentence carried the clearest proof yet of who he truly wanted. Not because it guaranteed you would choose him. Not because it erased anyone else. But because he had stopped thinking of love as returning to an old chapter. He wanted to know whether a new chapter could exist, one built with more clarity than the last. And if it could not, he was finally becoming mature enough to respect that truth too. There was no grand victory in that thought. There was dignity. The kind that allows two people to tell the truth without turning affection into pressure. Your soulmate looked back at your contact again. This time he did not search old photos or reread old conversations. He simply looked at your name and thought about who you might be now. What had changed in you? What had you learned while he was figuring himself out? Had you become more guarded? More peaceful? More certain about what you would and would not accept? Those questions made him realize something important. If he approached you expecting the exact person he remembered, he would already be making another mistake. He needed to meet you again, not simply recover you. That realization changed the emotional weight of everything. Suddenly, his secret decision was no longer about claiming a place in your future. It was about showing up honestly enough to discover whether there was still a place for both of you in each other's lives. The person who sent him the unexpected message added one final detail before the conversation ended. They told him there had been one particular night when you almost reached out first. You had apparently started writing something, reconsidered it, and stopped, not because you did not care, but because you had already been the one carrying too much uncertainty. You wanted to know whether your soulmate would ever choose clarity without being pulled toward it. When he read that, your soulmate felt the past align in a way it never had before. On one side, he had been waiting for proof from you. On the other, you had been waiting to see whether he could offer clarity on his own. Both of you were waiting, but for completely different things. And yesterday, finally, he understood the difference. That was when he pressed send. No dramatic countdown. No perfect timing. No certainty about what would happen next. Just one respectful message moving across the distance that had once felt impossible to cross. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Your soulmate placed the phone down, then picked it up again, then quietly laughed at himself and put it aside. He refused to build a story around the silence. He reminded himself that you had a life, that you owed him no immediate response, and that reaching out honestly was only his part. Your answer belonged to you. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The third party had already left the conversation behind, believing whatever happened next would be private. Your soulmate tried to focus on something else. Then the screen lit up. Your name appeared. For one brief second, everything he had rehearsed disappeared from his mind. He opened your reply slowly. It was shorter than he expected. There were no declarations. No dramatic emotion. Just a few careful words. But one sentence immediately changed the entire direction of what he thought would happen next, because instead of answering whether you wanted to talk, you wrote something that suggested you had been waiting for one particular truth from him all along, and now, before any real conversation could begin, you wanted to know whether he was finally ready to say it.